The animal kingdom. The animal kingdom. It is often wondered how so many creatures and species came about to live on this planet. Well, it all started many years ago with a scientist named Charles Darwin who introduced his theory for how life changed over great periods of time. His theory was evolution. During Darwin's travels, numerous observations were made as well as evidence collected. What he observed and collected led him to propose his theories. The area that had the most influence on Darwin's theories was the Galapagos Islands.
During his stay in the Galapagos Islands, Charles Darwin discovered 3 different types of tortoises. The first one was the saddleback. The second one was the intermediate dome-shelled tortoise. And the last one was the dome-shelled tortoise. This made Darwin wonder why 3 different tortoises on islands so close were so different.
While heading home, Darwin spent a great deal of time thinking about his findings. Darwin realized that the characteristics of many animals and plants varied noticeably among the different islands of the Galapagos. But Darwin's thoughts were not just the product of his own curiosity. Many previous works shaped his theories. Now, it was popular belief that the Earth was thousands of years old, but groups of scientists theorized that the Earth was in fact millions of years old, and that the same processes that affect the Earth in the past still continue to affect the Earth in the present. Now this principle of things changing very slowly over large periods of time gave Darwin the idea that the same principle might relate to the life on Earth.
Years before Darwin sailed to the Galapagos Islands, a man by the name of Lamarck came up with a theory of how life changed over time. Although the theory was eventually disproven, it led the way for Darwin to create his own theory of how life evolves.
For example, say a crab was to use his right claw more often than he used anything else. Over time, this right claw would become larger and more adaptable to what the crab was using it for. The crab would then have young that shared the same characteristic of the large right claw, and this would be passed on from generation to generation.
Another contributor to Darwin's theory was Thomas Malthus. In 1798, Malthus noticed that those being born outnumbered those that were dying. Malthus reasoned that if the human population continued to grow unchecked, sooner or later there would be insufficient living space and food for everyone.
This led Darwin to ask what caused the death of so many individuals, and what factor or factors determined which ones survive and reproduce.
Right on the set.
In 1836, Darwin returned to England and examined his specimens. The birds brought back that were believed to be assorted birds were actually all different variations of finches. Darwin began filling notebooks with thoughts and ideas about species diversity, the process later to be known as evolution. In 1858, Darwin received a short essay from a fellow naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace. It summarized the same ideas that Darwin had been mulling over. Darwin then decided to publish his work. 18 months later, he published On the Origin of Species.
Okay, now one of the first topics that Darwin touched on in his On the Origin of Species was natural variation, which is the differences between members of the same exact species. So they may be the same exact species, but they have slight differences that may lead them to compete. Now, these species is very closely related to humans, as you may be able to find out, but not quite as intelligent. But there are differences even among those 2 members of the same exact species. This one likes to eat rocks, this one likes to throw them. And this may eventually lead to competition between the species, and the one most fit to survive will continue to reproduce, and that is why Darwin believed that natural variation would be a good argument for how evolution works. Now, artificial selection was another topic that Darwin touched upon in On the Origin of Species, and I'm here with 2 farmers. One has a pistol. May I ask what you're doing with that pistol?
I'm gonna go harvest some cattle.
Harvesting cattle. Well, okay. Artificial selection. How does that apply to what you do?
Well, you see here, I own a herd of cattle. And the best way to have the best beneficial products for next year's harvest is to breed. So what we do is we breed the best dominant male and female, so when their offsprings are born, they'll have the traits from them.
Alright, so you breed the dominants, and the dominant traits are passed on. So basically,
Yeah.
when artificial selection is in use, it is humans controlling what traits are being passed on.
Darwin was convinced that something like natural variation took place in nature. Because of population growth and shortage of supplies, Darwin realized that this would force animals into competition. This was called the struggle for existence. A key factor in the struggle for existence, Darwin observed, was how well suited an organism was to its environment. This was called fitness. Over time, natural selection results in changes in the inherited characteristics of a population. These changes increase a species' fitness in its environment. Animals with a higher fitness are better fit to survive. This process is referred to as survival of the fittest.
Darwin argued that species have been evolving for over millions of years. 4 points that he used to prove his argument were fossil records, the homologous structures of organisms, similarities in early development, and geological distribution.
During his travels, Darwin realized that all over the world there were animals remarkably similar, and yet had their own unique qualities fit their environment. The similar species had descended from the same common ancestor. This was one piece of evidence towards evolution: geographic distribution of living things.
These two species, although remarkably similar, have different adaptations for their environments. The huskier one is more adapted towards Arctic weather, while the leaner one is more adapted towards savanna weather.
Another piece of evidence towards evolution is similar homologous body structures. In Darwin's time, similarities were noted of the bone structure of vertebrates. Take the arm, for example. Although they may be used as flippers, or arms, or wings, they are all constructed of the same basic bones. In the fetal stages of development, similarities between many different organisms can also be observed. Although not identical, it can be difficult to distinguish the difference between a turtle and a chicken embryo. Darwin's theory basically states individual organisms in nature differ from each other. Some of that is inherited. More animals are produced than can survive, and many of those survivors do not reproduce. Because of excess breeding, the members then have to compete for the resources. Each organism has its advantages and disadvantages, due to its being unique. Individuals best suited for survival will reproduce. Those characteristics are passed on to offspring. Species change over long periods of time due to natural selection. This causes new species to arise and some to disappear. Species alive today have descended with modifications from past species, and all organisms on Earth are united into one single tree of life by common descent. Darwin was at a great disadvantage because he did not understand how heredity worked. Without understanding heredity, Darwin was not able to answer the questions. What was the source of variation in his theory, and how were the traits passed on? Today, biologists focus on particular populations of certain species. Because these animals can breed with each other, they share the same group of genes, meaning they are part of the same gene pool.
Hey you, random person, what's a gene pool consist of?
Hey, usually a gene pool contains two or more of a certain gene, or allele. The number of times a certain allele occurs in the gene pool is relative frequency. For example, if there are an equal number of black and white rats, both have a relative frequency of 50%.
Wow.
Two main sources of genetic variation are mutations and the genetic shuffling that results from sexual reproduction. A mutation is any change in a sequence of DNA. They can occur because of mistakes in replication or as a result of radiation or chemicals. Gene shuffling is caused during meiosis. Because each chromosome moves independently, there can be a great number of outcomes for any species. The number of phenotypes produced for a given trait depends on how many genes control that trait. There are single gene traits which have only 2 different alleles, such as having dimples and not having dimples. But there are also polygenic traits, such as height, where there can be a great number of outcomes.
That's beautiful. Hey you! Yeah, you! Come here! Run faster! Alright, do you know what natural selection acts upon?
Why, yes, I do. Natural selection acts upon the phenotypes of genes, not the genes themselves. So, natural selection on single gene traits can lead to changes in allele frequencies and thus to evolution.
Thanks! A good example of natural selection would be, suppose red lizards are easy prey for predators. They would soon be extinct, and thus leaving only the black and brown lizards. These black lizards would be able to move faster because their skin attracts heat, and this will result in them able to reproduce more and survive.
Natural selection can affect the distributions of phenotype in any of 3 ways: directional selections, stabilizing selection, or disruptive selection. Directional selection is when individuals at one end of a curve have higher fitness than individuals at the end or in the middle. Thus, the wave seems to move to the right. Stabilizing selection is when those in the middle have a higher fitness than those at the higher ends, thus making the wave taller and more narrow. And disruptive selection is when individuals at both ends have a higher fitness than in the center, thus creating one wave into 2 very similar waves. But natural selection isn't the only cause of evolutionary change. An allele can become more common than another just by chance in a small population. In small populations, individuals that carry a particular allele may leave more descendants than the others, just by chance. Over time, a series of chance occurrences of this type can cause an allele to become common in a population.
But are there ways for those changes to take place? 2 researchers proposed that if certain set of standards were taking place, then evolution would not occur. The Hardy-Weinberg principle states that genetic equilibrium can occur if there is random mating, so that there is equal chances to mate for everyone. A large population, so genetic drift does not have such an effect. No movement in or out of the population, so no new alleles will be introduced. No mutations, so no new allele will be introduced, and no natural selection, so all phenotypes have an equal chance of reproduction and survival.
Due to genetic variation, some of the males of this species have become more masculine, while some have remained feminine. At the same time, the females have come to prefer either the more masculine or more feminine males. This causes speciation because their behavior isolates the 2 groups. This is known as behavioral isolation.
Another type of speciation is geographic isolation. Geographic isolation occurs when 2 parts of a species are separated by a geographic or physical barrier, such as a raging river. A raging river. In this case, some members of the species have gained the ability to cross the raging river. And from this point, members of the species will separate and go on their different paths.
Sunday night. You know what that means?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'm more of a Monday man myself.
Well, you know, pretty soon we're going to be temporarily isolated if we keep doing it like this.
What does temporarily isolated mean?
Temporally isolation is when members of the same species are separated by the time they reproduce.
Does that have to do with evolution?
Yes, it does.
So what if all this evidence proves evolution true? Where is the human race going? What will we look like in the next few 100,000 years? Only time will tell.
This is Joe, director, writer, cinematography genius. Will, actor, ID giver, father. Steven, actor, cameraman. We're gonna miss you, Steven. Rest in peace.
Stop. Cut it off. Just turn it off.
Diana, scriptwriter, actor. Very small actor. How small would you say she was, Joe?
I'd say very, very small. Very small. Yeah, very small. Very
Quite small.
Very quite. Hey, who's that? I don't remember seeing him on the film at all.
Well, that's Abdullah. He was the main cameraman. He's the guy who sort of kept the team together. Sort of like a father figure to me. Not really, though.
Not really a father figure, but
No.
kind of a... I see, okay.
David, actor, sound effects.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
Hi, my name is Jean-Claude Van Damme, and I'm the sponsors of this show. I first met Joe 4 years ago. Saw 3 of his tapes. I mean, movies. From that moment on, I knew Joe was going to be one of the greatest directors ever. Better than Spielberg. All I gotta say is, keep filming, Joe. Keep filming. I love you.
Kill our enemies with swords.